Tonight we're wandering into one of the most unusual little stories in American history. The time a small mountain town elected a golden retriever as mayor. It started as a joke, but it turned into a tradition and eventually a legend. Before we begin, you can like this video and subscribe only if you truly enjoy these slow, strange journeys. And let me know in the comments where you're listening from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see this sleepy little community scattered across the world. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's drift quietly into another time and place. You arrive in a place so unhurried that time itself seems to take a break here. The road into town is narrow, 2 lanes at most, and bends lazily between fields that look like they've been growing the same grass for decades. You pass a handful of faded billboards, most of them for businesses that might not even exist anymore, and eventually find yourself on Main Street. Main Street, of course, is not particularly main. It's a short stretch of road with one diner, one hardware store, a post office the size of a living room, and a small, polite grocery store that still sells milk in glass bottles if you know to ask for it. The houses are modest, a mix of small clapboard homes and old farmhouses, many of them painted in colors that were fashionable 40 years ago and have since been left to fade gently in the sun. In some yards, there are lawn chairs that seem to have been placed purely for the purpose of sitting and watching absolutely nothing happen. People do sit there too, sometimes for hours. They don't appear to be waiting for anything in particular, but in a place like this, watching the wind move through the trees can be a full day's entertainment. The air here has a different rhythm. Cars pass only every few minutes, and when they do, they go slowly, because they know the driver is likely to stop halfway to wave at someone they know. The soundscape is minimal, a distant tractor working its way across a field, the faint clang of a shop bell as someone pushes open the diner door, the steady hum of cicadas. If it's summer, if you listen closely, you might hear a dog barking in the distance. Not an urgent bark, just the kind that says, "I've seen something mildly interesting, and I'm going to announce it." This is a town where everyone knows everyone, but it goes deeper than that. Everyone knows everyone's grandparents, their cousins, the make and model of their car, and exactly how long they've had it. If you move here, it's possible people will know your business before you even unpack. The local gossip is not malicious, it's just thorough. If Mrs. Henderson's washing machine breaks, she'll have half a dozen offers to fix it within the hour. If the Johnson boy wins a spelling bee, you'll hear about it in the checkout line at the grocery store, in the pews at church, and from someone leaning over the fence while you're watering your tomatoes. And when it comes to politics, the atmosphere is just as laid back. The mayor's job is less about making big decisions and more about making sure the potholes eventually get fixed and the annual summer festival happens on schedule. It's a ceremonial position, and the campaigns are so quiet they're almost invisible. 2 or 3 people might run, but usually they're doing it because nobody else wanted the role. Sometimes In fact, the winner didn't even want to win. The debates, if you can call them that, happen in the form of casual conversations at the diner, with more discussion about pie flavors than policy. The town's budget is modest, the meetings are short. The decisions are made over coffee, sometimes literally, in a booth with a cracked vinyl seat and a view of the parking lot. In this sleepy, well-worn corner of the world, no one is looking for excitement from local government. Stability is valued far more than change. And as long as the 4th of July parade starts on time and the Christmas lights go up in early December, no one complains. Yet, underneath the calm, something else exists. A quiet readiness for anything unusual. The people here have a certain sense of humor about their own lives. And because nothing much changes, anything unexpected is cherished and retold for years. Which is why, when a certain four-legged citizen made history in this very town, the story didn't just ripple through the community. It became part of its identity. Outsiders might shake their heads in disbelief, but to the people who lived here, it was just another reminder that in a town where life moves this slowly, you have plenty of time to let an unusual idea take root. It all began, as most things here do, in a conversation that was half serious and half a joke. A few people sitting in the diner, a cup of coffee cooling beside a plate of toast, and someone, we'll never know who for sure, made a suggestion so absurd that it looped all the way round into brilliance. In a place where the mayor's job was mostly ceremonial, and the campaigns were forgettable, why not let a candidate everyone loved take the position? Someone who didn't argue, didn't play politics, and was always genuinely happy to see you. Someone who could greet visitors at the edge of town with a wagging tail. Someone with floppy ears. And so, in the most natural way possible, the stage was set for a golden retriever to become mayor. Not because the town was rebellious or chaotic, but because in this particular place, where life was unhurried and people took delight in the small things, it somehow made perfect sense. Before the golden retriever came along, this town had a long line of human mayors. The kind of people who were, for the most part, respectable, dependable, and completely forgettable. Their photographs hang in a narrow hallway inside the town hall. A dim corridor that smells faintly of old paper and lemon-scented furniture polish. Each frame is neatly labeled with a name and the years they served. And yet, if you stopped someone on the street and asked them about Mayor Jenkins of 82, you'd likely get a polite shrug. Maybe a vague, "Oh yes, I think he liked fishing." It's not that they were bad at their jobs. Quite the opposite. They were perfectly adequate, which is exactly why no one remembers them. A mayor here was never expected to solve national problems or launch big reforms. They were expected to show up at ribbon cuttings, announce the winner of the pie baking contest at the summer fair, and occasionally give a speech that was short enough not to make people restless in the heat. The bar was not set high, and everyone was happy to keep it that way. Most mayors had full-time jobs elsewhere. One was a retired teacher, another ran the local hardware store, and one particularly quiet fellow owned a bait shop by the river. They did their mayoral duties in the evenings or on weekends, often with the help of a spouse or a neighbor. Sometimes their speeches were written on the back of a grocery receipt. Sometimes the annual holiday budget was decided in a 10-minute chat after church. The pace of governance here was less political machine and more family meeting after dinner. Of course, they did leave small marks on the town, but the kind of marks you don't notice until decades later. Mayor Douglas was responsible for planting the row of maple trees that now shade the sidewalk on Main Street. Mayor Langley introduced the idea of adding a second drinking fountain outside the library, just in case the first one breaks. Mayor Allen approved the purchase of a new fire truck in 1979, a decision still fondly remembered by exactly 2 people. Both of them retired firefighters. There were never scandals, never heated debates, never moments that made the evening news. If there were disagreements in the council meetings, they were usually about things like whether the benches in the park should be painted green or blue. And even then, after a few minutes, someone would say, "Well, whichever color's cheaper," and that would be the end of it. The people of the town liked it that way. Politics wasn't something to get worked up about. It was something that happened quietly in the background, like the streetlights turning on at dusk. The stability was comforting, the predictability almost soothing. And while the rest of the country occasionally churned with drama, this place seemed immune to it. That is, until someone, or rather something, took office who would be remembered forever. The Golden Retriever's rise to power didn't come because the human mayors failed. In fact, it was their very lack of drama that made the idea possible. People here were used to the idea that the mayor's job was mostly symbolic. So when the suggestion came to elect a dog, the leap wasn't as wild as it might seem to an outsider. After all, if your mayors are remembered more for pie contests than policies, maybe a friendly face with floppy ears could do just as well, maybe even better. But before we get to that election, it's worth pausing to appreciate this forgotten era of human leadership, because without those steady, humble, utterly unremarkable mayors, the town might never have been ready for something as extraordinary and as delightfully strange as what came next. There comes a point in any small town's life when the sameness becomes so complete, so reliable, that it begins to wrap around and turn into a kind of quiet restlessness. Not the loud kind, not the "we must protest in the streets" kind, but the gentle, fidgety feeling of people who have been sitting in the same chair for too long. In this town, that chair was the mayor's seat, not literally. The mayor's chair was an old padded office chair with one squeaky wheel, but figuratively, the whole institution felt worn in. Year after year, the same rhythms played out. A mayor would be elected with little fuss. They would spend a couple of years making sure the flower beds by the welcome sign got watered and that the annual budget was passed on time. They'd be photographed holding a pair of scissors at a ribbon cutting, smiling politely. Then they'd step down, and another equally polite, equally practical person would take their place. It was a process so smooth, it might as well have been automated. If there had been a mayoral duties switch somewhere in town, it could have been left in the on position for decades, without anyone needing to touch it. The townspeople weren't unhappy, far from it. Life here was pleasant, but pleasantness when uninterrupted, can start to feel flat. It's like eating the same perfectly cooked oatmeal every morning for years. It's nourishing, it's fine, but after a while, you start daydreaming about pancakes, or toast with too much jam, or anything that isn't oatmeal. The political oatmeal here had been simmering for so long that people had almost forgotten other flavors existed. It wasn't that they craved change in the way bigger cities do, with ambitious campaigns and reform promises. No, here they craved change the way you crave a new decoration for the mantelpiece, or a different song on the jukebox at the diner. Something small, something to make people lean back in their chairs and say, "Well now, isn't that something?" The signs of this quiet boredom could be spotted in little ways. At council meetings, the audience would sometimes drift into conversations about fishing or the weather while official business droned on. At the diner, people would playfully invent better slogans for the town, none of them serious, some of them mildly ridiculous. And when election season rolled around, the energy was, well, there wasn't much energy at all. Voter turnout was never particularly high, but lately it had started to feel like an afterthought. People would forget the date until the morning of, and then wander into the polling station in their work boots or overalls, vote, and head straight back to whatever they'd been doing. Nobody was invested enough to campaign hard. Nobody even seemed to care who won, as long as the garbage was collected and the 4th of July fireworks still happened. It was in this gentle haze of contented monotony that the idea of electing a dog would take root. The town didn't know it yet, but its appetite for something whimsical was growing. The perfect conditions were forming, not for political upheaval, but for something far better, a story worth telling, worth remembering, worth smiling about for years to come. And all it would take was a spark, or, in this case, a wagging tail. Long before anyone thought of ballots or elections, before anyone even joked about it over coffee at the diner, the golden retriever in question was just the dog. Not a dog, but the dog. The one everyone in town seemed to know, even if they weren't exactly sure whose dog he was. His name, depending on who you asked, was either Max or Mayor Max, or that nice dog who likes biscuits. Names didn't matter much here. What mattered was that this golden retriever was as much a fixture of the town as the clock above the post office. You might first notice him padding down Main Street on a cool morning, the mist still hanging low over the rooftops, his fur catching the faint gold of the rising sun. There was a rhythm to the way he moved, unhurried, with a sort of calm assurance, as though he had already inspected the day and found it acceptable. If the local hardware store was open, he might wander in for a pat on the head. If the bakery door was propped open, he might linger just long enough to inhale the smell of fresh bread before moving along. Everyone knew his route. Mornings were for downtown greetings, a small patrol of familiar storefronts and friendly faces. Afternoons were for the park, where he would sprawl on the grass like an old general surveying his troops, occasionally getting up to trot over to a child with a sandwich or a group of teenagers tossing a frisbee. Evenings, if you were lucky, you might see him on the porch of the little yellow house by the river, dozing while the water murmured by. The thing about this dog, and it was the thing that made him so perfect for what would later come, was that he had no sense of exclusivity. He didn't belong to just one person. Oh, legally, of course. There was an owner, a retired woman named Margaret, who had the gentle habit of letting her door stand open, so the dog could come and go as he pleased. But the dog's social calendar extended far beyond Margaret's front yard. He had friends at the post office, where the clerk kept a jar of small biscuits behind the counter. He had an understanding with the man who ran the gas station, who would always top up his water bowl by the door. He had a standing arrangement with the elementary school, where children would crowd at the fence to see if he'd stroll by during recess. And he had an unspoken pact with the diner. If he wandered in and sat by the corner booth, someone would eventually accidentally drop a piece of bacon. Every single person in town had their own little story about him. How he once helped the delivery truck driver by riding along for a short loop around the block. How he showed up, uninvited but welcome, at 3 separate weddings in the same summer. How he somehow knew to sit patiently outside the library every Thursday, the day Margaret volunteered there, until she emerged. He wasn't just well-liked, he was trusted. In a place where people still left their keys in the ignition while running into the store. Trust wasn't hard to come by, but even here, he stood out. You could hand him a sandwich, and he'd wait for you to give the okay before taking it. You could ask him to stay outside the town hall, and he would, at least, until someone important-looking emerged, at which point he'd trot forward for a handshake, or rather, a head pat. And because this is a small town, word of every little kindness spread quickly. That dog sat with my mother when she was on the bench alone. Someone might say, "Oh, he walked my son home from school once." Another would chime in. Slowly, without any deliberate plan, he became woven into the fabric of the town's daily life. By the time anyone thought about elections, it wasn't the idea of a dog running for mayor. It was that dog, this dog, the one who already knew everyone's name, or at least their scent, the one who had already attended more community events than some actual mayors, the one whose calm, unflappable nature made him seem like he'd been in politics all his life. And yet, at this stage, it was just life as usual. A dog making his rounds, a town smiling at the sight of him, and the slow, quiet gathering of a story that was about to get much, much bigger. In a town where nothing ever really happens fast, even the smallest idea tends to roll in like a gentle fog, rather than strike like lightning. And so it was with the moment everything began to shift. Nobody could point to the exact second when the notion of electing the golden retriever went from a passing joke to a real, actual possibility. It didn't happen in a meeting. It didn't happen in a campaign office. It happened the way so many small-town stories happen. Over coffee, in the kind of place where the coffee is hot, the mugs are mismatched, and the waitress calls you hun, whether you're 18 or 80. It was a Tuesday, one of those comfortably predictable Tuesdays that seem to come with their own built-in rhythm. The sun had been up for a few hours, bright enough to make the diner's front windows almost too warm if you sat in the booth by the door. The special on the chalkboard was meatloaf, the same as it had been every Tuesday since anyone could remember. A couple of regulars sat at the counter, hunched over their plates, while the owner's radio played softly in the background. Old country songs, the kind with slow guitar strums and just enough twang to match the creak of the diner's floorboards. At the corner table, 3 people were talking politics, or at least their version of it. In this town, politics usually meant swapping mild complaints about the price of gas, debating whether the pothole on Maple Street was really getting worse or just seemed that way, and occasionally wondering aloud if the current mayor's speeches were always that short, or if he'd just been in a hurry lately. That morning, the conversation had drifted into the familiar territory of the upcoming elections. Nobody was particularly excited. Nobody could remember the names of all the candidates. That's when someone, depending on who's telling the story, it was either Bill from the hardware store or Sherry who runs the hair salon, casually said, "We ought to just elect Max." It got a laugh. Of course it did. The idea of a dog sitting behind the mayor's desk was instantly funny, in the way only harmless absurdity can be. They pictured him at the council table, tail thumping, maybe wearing a little tie. They imagined his campaign slogan, "More treats, fewer leashes." Somebody even suggested he'd be better at greeting tourists than anyone else in town. And then, as jokes sometimes do, it lingered a little longer than it should have. No one moved on right away. Someone pointed out that Max actually knew more townsfolk by name than some mayors had. Someone else mentioned how he'd been at the last 4 parades, the ribbon cutting for the new playground, and the annual pancake breakfast, without ever needing an official invitation. The talk snowballed, not quickly, but steadily. A man at the counter turned around and chimed in. "You know," he said, "he's never raised taxes." More laughter. Someone else added, "And he's never taken a bribe." Even the waitress got in on it. Well, unless you count bacon. By the time lunch rolled around, the idea had drifted out of the diner and into the barber shop next door. From there, it crossed the street to the post office, and by late afternoon it had reached the park, where a few teenagers tossed a frisbee and speculated about what campaign posters for a dog would look like. The way gossip travels in a small town is never straight or predictable. It moves like a lazy river, winding around, doubling back, picking up bits and pieces from each person who dips a toe in. The next morning, the same people met at the diner, and the topic came up again. This time, it wasn't just a joke. This time, someone asked, "Do you think we actually could?" That question hung in the air for a while. The thought of it, not the joke, but the actual possibility, was strangely compelling. The more they considered it, the less ridiculous it seemed. After all, what was a mayor here, really? The mayor didn't negotiate with foreign dignitaries. The mayor didn't have a motorcade or a security detail. The mayor made sure budgets balanced, signed a few documents, and showed up for town events. And Max, well, Max was already showing up for everything that mattered. By Thursday, the talk had reached Margaret Max's owner, who found herself fielding curious, almost shy questions. Would you let him run? They'd ask. as though she might be the final gatekeeper between the town and its most unusual election. Margaret, to her credit, didn't shut the idea down. She laughed, said she wasn't sure if he had the right wardrobe for the job, but she didn't say no. And in a small town, not saying no is as good as leaving the door wide open. That weekend, someone printed a single poster. It was nothing fancy, just a photo of Max sitting in the park, looking noble in that way only golden retrievers can, with the words "Vote Max" underneath in bold red letters. They taped it in the diner's front window. Passers-by noticed it, smiled, took photos, and then someone, nobody's quite sure who, made a second poster. What had started as a throwaway comment over coffee was beginning to take shape. And though the town still didn't fully realize it, the wheels, slow, slightly squeaky wheels, us was the town's style, had started turning toward a very different kind of election season. By the time the second Vote Max poster went up, the town had quietly, and perhaps without fully realizing it, slipped into something resembling an election season. Only if you'd come from somewhere else. Somewhere with bustling campaign headquarters and glossy political ads, you might not have recognized it as such. There were no press conferences, no hurried meetings in back rooms, no sharp suits or sound bites. The only strategy was whatever people happened to say over breakfast, and the closest thing to a campaign manager was whoever happened to have a free afternoon to draw paw prints on a poster. The first week of Max's campaign felt less like politics and more like, well, like the town was collectively playing a game. Children made hand-drawn signs with crayons, crooked block letters spelling out Mayor Max in bright, uneven colors. A retired carpenter offered to make a wooden sign for Margaret's front yard, which he did in the slow, meticulous way carpenters do, sanding the edges smooth and painting the name in a deep, friendly shade of blue. At the post office, people started slipping little envelopes addressed to Mayor Max into the box, each one stuffed with silly policy suggestions. Some were obvious jokes, free belly rubs for all citizens, mandatory nap time after lunch, but a few were oddly practical, like fix the swing at the park or get more benches by the river. Margaret kept every single one, tucking them into a shoebox that would soon become too small for the growing pile. And yet, even without official rallies or speeches, the town was rallying in its own quiet way. The grocery store owner put up a cardboard cutout of Max near the register, and it became a sort of impromptu selfie spot. Kids would tug on their parents' sleeves, insisting on a photo with the mayor. The coffee shop started serving a mayor's special, just a plain black coffee for the grown-ups and a little cup of whipped cream for their dogs. It's important to understand that in this town, everything moved at a pace that would have driven a city strategist absolutely mad. A single conversation might meander from potholes to pumpkin pie recipes to whether or not the autumn leaves were turning earlier than last year before ever circling back to the election. The campaign for Max was no different. Someone might suggest making buttons, but a week could pass before anyone actually ordered them. When they finally arrived, they were simple little things. white background, red letters, a paw print in the center. Somehow, they were perfect. Margaret herself never tried to push the idea, but she also didn't stop it. She let Max keep being Max, greeting everyone he met with a slow wag of his tail, sitting patiently outside the bakery until someone inevitably handed him a biscuit, lying on the grass in the park while children read books to him. Without realizing it, he was running the most effective campaign in town history, being exactly who he already was. One afternoon, a local reporter, really just a college student home for the summer, writing for the weekly paper, decided to interview Max. The article was mostly tongue-in-cheek, featuring lines like, when asked about his plans for the town's infrastructure, Max offered no comment but seemed deeply focused on a nearby squirrel. It ran on the front page with a large photo of Max wearing a red bandana, and suddenly the election was no longer just a local joke. The piece got picked up by a regional news outlet, then a national one. A radio host mentioned it, and before anyone knew it, the sleepy American town found itself answering phone calls from reporters in faraway cities who were quite sincerely curious about the four-legged mayoral candidate. Most places would have seized on this attention, tried to spin it into momentum. This town didn't. They just kept doing what they were doing, which, in this case, meant hanging more hand-painted signs, baking poor-shaped cookies for the bake sale, and laughing at the absurdity of it all. The campaign trail for Max wasn't a trail at all. It was the same streets he walked every day, the same people he saw every week, the same friendly hellos. And somehow, that was enough. By the time voting day came around, the town wasn't just in on the joke anymore. They were part of it, invested in it. People weren't voting to make fun of politics. They were voting for something simpler, something warmer, a shared story they'd all helped tell, one wagging tail at a time. The morning of the election began quietly, as all mornings did in that town. The sun lifted itself slowly over the line of maple trees at the eastern edge, brushing everything in that warm, honey-colored light that makes even cracked sidewalks look almost poetic. The air held the faint crispness of early autumn, enough to make people pull their jackets a little tighter as they stepped outside. Down on Main Street, the old church hall was serving as the polling station, just as it had for decades. It was a building with creaky floorboards, tall, narrow windows, and a faint smell of varnish mixed with coffee. Every election year, volunteers arrived early to set up the folding tables and tape handwritten signs. Enter here and exit this way, to the double doors. But this year, those signs had something extra. Small paw print stickers scattered round the edges, a silent nod to the candidate everyone knew by name. The first voters came in just after the doors opened. Many of them were the kind of early risers who had already been up for hours, farmers with dirt still clinging to their boots, the postman who always started his route before sunrise, retirees who liked to get things done before the rush. They greeted the volunteers, signed their names in the ledger, and stepped into the curtained booths one by one, Some smiled as they folded their ballots, as if they were in on a delightful little secret. Margaret brought Max in mid-morning. She had brushed his coat until it gleamed, tied his red mayor scarf neatly around his neck, and given him a biscuit to keep him occupied during the walk. When they reached the church hall, Max trotted up the steps, as if he knew exactly where he was supposed to go. People outside stopped to greet him, bending down to scratch his head, some whispering good luck as though he could actually understand. Inside, the mood felt different from most elections. Usually there's a hum of tension in the air, a seriousness about the whole business of voting. But here there was a softness, conversations drifting between recipes and local gossip, the smell of fresh coffee wafting from the corner where a volunteer had set up a refreshment table. Even those who weren't voting for Max, and yes, there were a few, did so without malice. It was, in every sense, the friendliest election day anyone could remember. Children came with their parents, tugging at their sleeves to hurry up so they could say hello to the candidate. One little boy, no more than 5, solemnly handed Max a crayon drawing of a dog behind a desk. "It's you at work," he explained. Margaret tucked it gently into her bag. As the hours passed, more townsfolk arrived, shop owners stepping away from their counters, teachers stopping by after school let out early, and a few out-of-town visitors who had read about the election in the paper and wanted to see it for themselves. Some of them didn't even know they could cast a vote, but they lingered anyway, sipping coffee, chatting with the locals, and taking photos with Max. By late afternoon, the hall was busier than anyone expected. The line to vote sometimes reached out onto the sidewalk, but no one seemed to mind. A cool breeze carried the smell of leaves and wood smoke, and the chatter from inside spilled into the street. You could hear the occasional laugh, the shuffle of boots on the wooden floor, the faint creak of the ballot box lid as it opened and closed. When the doors finally shut at 7 p.m., the volunteers began the slow, methodical process of counting the votes. There were no machines here, no scanning devices, just paper ballots, a stack of rubber bands, and careful hands. Max sat patiently near the front, resting his chin on his paws, looking for all the world like a mare awaiting the results of a close race. But the truth was, it wasn't close at all. By the time the last ballot was tallied, the outcome was obvious. The majority had gone to Max, not by a landslide exactly, but by a margin so comfortable that even the most skeptical citizen had to smile. The volunteers didn't announce it with a booming declaration. Instead, the news spread the way all news spreads in small towns. One whispered comment, then a laugh, then another person leaning over to share it again. "Max won," someone said, and a ripple of applause traveled through the hall. People clapped, not in the wild, roaring way of big city celebrations, but in a gentle, almost affectionate way. The kind of applause you give at a school play, or when someone tells a really good story. Margaret knelt down beside Max, giving him a scratch behind the ears. "Well, Mr. Mayor," she said softly. "Looks like you've got work to do." Max's tail thumped once against the wooden floor. Whether he understood or not, he certainly looked the part. And just like that, the sleepy American town had a new mayor. Morning came quietly in the little American town, as though the streets themselves wanted to tiptoe into this unusual chapter of their history. The sun rose behind a thin veil of mist, softening the light into something warm and almost sleepy. In the distance, a single rooster called out, its voice echoing off the gentle slopes. And in a small, cozy house on the edge of town, the new mayor, a golden retriever named Max, stretched, yawned, and padded to the kitchen for breakfast, blissfully unaware that today was supposed to be different from any other. Margaret, on the other hand, was very aware. She had been up early, making sure Max's red MAYOR scarf was freshly washed and pressed. The letters on it, bright white against the deep red fabric, looked crisp in the morning light. She filled his water bowl, poured his kibble, and even slipped in a small piece of leftover roast chicken as a celebratory treat. Max wagged his tail at this unexpected bonus, crunching happily while Margaret sipped her coffee and ran through the day's plan in her head. By mid-morning, the town's main street had begun to stir. Shopkeepers turned signs from closed to open. The post office door creaked open for its usual trickle of customers, and the bell above the diner door jingled as regulars shuffled in for their morning coffee. But this day had something extra, a little hum of anticipation that floated just above the normal rhythm of things. People paused in doorways, waiting to catch a glimpse of their new mayor on his way to work. At 9 a.m., Margaret and Max set out from their homes. She carried a small leather satchel. Inside, not important documents, but a few treats. A collapsible water bowl and a squeaky tennis ball in case Max got restless. They walked the short distance to the town hall, their path lined with neighbors who called out greetings like morning mayor and looking sharp Max. Town hall itself was a modest 2-story brick building with a slightly faded American flag waving from a pole out front. On normal days, you might pass it without much notice. But today, a small crowd had gathered, not for a formal ceremony, but simply to witness the moment. Some had brought cameras, others just brought their own dogs, who wagged their tails in solidarity. Inside, the air was cool and faintly smelled of floor polish and old paper. The clerk, Mrs. Henderson, greeted them warmly. She had worked at town hall longer than anyone could remember, and had a way of treating every visitor as if they were the most important person in the county. "Welcome, Mayor," she said, offering Max a dog biscuit from a jar she had placed on the counter. "Your office is ready." The office in question was really just the mayor's small desk in the corner of the main room. On it sat a brass nameplate, hastily made by the local hardware store, reading Mayor Max. Beside it was a water dish, a neatly folded blanket, and a little jar of peanut butter sticks donated by the bakery down the street. Margaret guided Max over, where he circled twice before flopping down with a sigh, his tail giving a slow, contented sweep across the floor. The rest of the morning unfolded in a way that could only happen in a town like this. A few residents stopped by with questions about street repairs or the upcoming harvest festival. Not because they expected Max to answer, but because it felt right to bring it to the mayor. Max listened patiently, head tilted, as if giving each matter serious thought. Occasionally, he'd lift a paw, which people began interpreting as his official stamp of approval. Around noon, the diner sent over a mayoral lunch, a paper plate piled high with bacon strips carefully drained of grease, and a small burger patty, no bun. Max ate it in the sunshine outside, while Margaret chatted with the cook, who said, "You know, I've never been more excited about local politics." The afternoon brought a surprise visit from the elementary school's third-grade class. 23 children filed in, each carrying a card they had made, covered in paw prints, hearts, and crayon drawings of Max in a suit and tie. The mayor greeted them enthusiastically, wagging so hard his scarf went slightly crooked. Margaret straightened it, smiling at the thought that no human politician could have made this moment feel so purely joyful. By the time the sun began to sink, painting the town in soft gold, the first day was nearly done. Max had received more head pats than any mayor in history, several donations of treats from well-wishers, and an informal promise from the townspeople that his policies, which mostly involved more community picnics and dog-friendly spaces, would be fully supported. As they walked home, Margaret felt the strange weight of the day, not the heavy weight of responsibility, but a warm, light one, like carrying a basket of freshly baked bread. The town had chosen something different, something gentle, and in doing so, they had given themselves a reason to smile together. Max, padding beside her, didn't know about the history books or the headlines. He only knew that people had been happy to see him, that his water bowl had been full, and that there had been more bacon than usual. And for a mayor, even a four-legged one, that seemed like a very good start. The second morning of Max's mayoral term began much like the first, with a gentle sunrise sliding over the low hills, a slow chorus of birds warming up for the day, and the faint smell of fresh bread drifting from the bakery to streets over. But this morning, there was a quiet undercurrent of curiosity in town. People were wondering, what would the new mayor's first official action be? Of course, no one was expecting sweeping legislation or dramatic reforms. This was, after all, a golden retriever in charge. But the novelty of the situation seemed to invite small acts of symbolism. And in a town this small, symbolism weight. Margaret poured her coffee and looked down at Max, who was lying on the kitchen floor with his chin resting on one paw. His red MAYOR scarf hung a little loose from yesterday's wear. She tightened the knot, smoothed the fabric, and said, "Big day, Mr. Mayor. Time to make a decision." The decision in question had arrived the evening before, slipped under the door of the town hall in the form of a handwritten letter. It was from two neighboring shop owners, the owner of the Cobbler's Bench, a small shoe repair shop, and the owner of Finley's Fresh Market, the local grocery. The two had been quietly disagreeing for weeks over a small strip of land between their properties, One wanted to use it for a garden. The other wanted to expand his shop's outdoor display. It wasn't a bitter feud, not yet, but it had begun to feel tense. In a regular mayoral term, this might have required paperwork, negotiations, maybe even a formal meeting. But with Mayor Max, people were curious. How would he handle it? When Margaret and Max arrived at the town hall, the two shopkeepers were already there, standing somewhat awkwardly by the front desk. Mrs. Henderson, the clerk, raised her eyebrows as if to say, "This should be interesting." Margaret led Max to his blanket in the corner, gave him a small biscuit, and then invited the shopkeepers to explain the situation. They took turns, speaking slowly and respectfully, but with a clear edge of stubbornness. Max listened, or at least gave the impression of listening, his head tilting slightly from side to side as they spoke. When they had finished, Margaret leaned down toward Max. "Well, Mr. Mayor, what's your ruling?" Max blinked at her, then stood, stretched in that long, back-arching way dogs do, and trotted over. Not to either shopkeeper, but to the strip of land in question. The little plot sat just a short walk down Main Street, a thin wedge of sunlit grass between the cobbler's neatly painted exterior and the grocery's shaded side wall. A small group of townspeople had followed, curious to see what would happen. Max sniffed the grass, inspected the base of a young maple tree, then, to the crowd's mild amusement, lay down right in the middle of it. He let out a contented sigh and closed his eyes, as though the whole question of ownership was irrelevant compared to the pleasure of a warm patch of ground. There was a pause. Then someone in the crowd chuckled and said, "Looks like the mayor's decided it's a public space." Another voice added, "He's right. If the mayor likes it here, maybe we should all share it." And just like that, the tension softened. The two shopkeepers exchanged a sheepish look. One of them shrugged and said, "Fine, we'll make it a little park. Folks can sit here, maybe have lunch." The other nodded in agreement. They even started tossing around ideas for a bench and some flowers. By the time Max returned to town hall, tail wagging, entirely unaware he had just resolved a dispute, the decision was already being referred to as a green patch compromise. It became a small but meaningful addition to the town, a shady place to rest, with a plaque reading, "Dedicated by Mayor Max, who reminded us to share." Margaret thought about it that evening as she brushed Max's coat on the porch. No politician could have negotiated that quickly, that gently, or that unanimously. Sometimes, she realized, the best decisions weren't made with words, but with presence, with simply being there and letting people figure out the rest. In the months to come, more small decisions would follow. Which route the town parade should take. Max followed the scent of grilled corn to the fairgrounds. Whether to allow dogs inside the diner patio. Max's polite waiting outside swayed the vote, and even the choice of the Harvest Festival's theme. He picked the pumpkin booth to nap under, which was as good as any endorsement. The town slowly began to understand that Max's style of leadership wasn't about decrees or orders. It was about leaning into the small joys, the quiet moments, and the shared spaces that reminded people they were neighbors first and anything else second. Pound so, without speeches, without campaigns, without even understanding the concept of mayor. Max had given the town something rare, a leader everyone liked, not because he solved every problem, but because he reminded them that problems didn't have to be so big in the first place. By the time autumn rolled around, Mayor Max had settled into his role like an old shoe, comfortable, dependable, and always there when you needed him. The town had adapted to his unique brand of leadership, which mostly involved being present for events, letting people pet him during council breaks, and appearing in more photographs than any mayor in town history. That year, the annual Harvest Festival was on everyone's mind. It was the biggest event of the season, the kind of small-town celebration where Main Street closed to traffic, stalls lined the sidewalks, and the air was thick with the smells of cinnamon, roasting nuts, and fresh apple cider. People came from nearby towns, sometimes even a few counties over, just to see what Bailey Springs, population barely over 2,000, could pull off. The planning had started months before, but this year there was a new wrinkle. Mayor Max, the committee, led by Mrs. Wilkins from the library, decided that the mayor had to be involved. "If we can't have the mayor open the festival," she told the group, "then what's the point of having one at all?" The suggestion sparked a wave of ideas. Someone proposed a ceremonial ribbon cutting, but scissors and paws didn't exactly mix. Someone else floated the idea of Max leading the parade, but that seemed almost too predictable. Then Margaret spoke up. "What if Max has his own booth?" The idea caught fire instantly. They'd call it Mayor Max's Greeting Station, where visitors could meet the mayor, take a photo, and get an official autograph. It was silly, yes, but in a town that had just elected a dog, silliness had become something of a civic value. When the festival day finally arrived, it felt as though the entire town had dressed itself in autumn. Pumpkins lined doorways, bales of hay became makeshift benches, and the maple trees along Main Street seemed to have chosen that week to explode into a riot of red, gold, and orange. The air carried just enough of a chill to remind you winter wasn't far off, but the sun's warmth lingered long enough to keep hands comfortable without gloves. Max arrived mid-morning, wearing his now iconic red MAYOR scarf and a small, custom-made sash that read Official Greeter. Margaret had brushed him until his coat gleamed, and the way the autumn light caught the golden tones in his fur made him look almost regal, if a little drooly. The greeting station was set up right at the heart of the festival, near the gazebo, with a small table for paw print, stamping, and a jar of treats at the ready. The first few visitors approached shyly, laughing at the novelty of it all. But within an hour, there was a line that snaked halfway down the street. Children crouched beside him for photos. Elderly couples patted his head like he was an old friend. And tourists, genuine out-of-towners, who'd heard something about a dog mayor, were delighted to find the rumors true. Margaret kept a gentle pace, making sure Max had breaks for water and the occasional stroll to stretch his legs. It was during one of these strolls that fate or perhaps just timing, nudged the story toward something bigger. A man with a camera and a press badge hanging from his neck approached Margaret. He introduced himself as Ben Carter, a reporter for a regional lifestyle magazine. He'd come to the festival for a piece on quaint autumn events, but the moment he saw Max, he knew his focus had changed. "Ma'am," he said with a grin, "I think I just found my headline. The American town with a dog for mayor." Margaret laughed, thinking it was just a joke, but within minutes, Ben was crouched beside Max, snapping photos as the golden retriever posed, or rather, simply existed in his usual good-natured way. He asked Margaret about the election, the town, and what it was like having a dog in charge. She answered as best she could, though half the time she felt as though she were describing a storybook character rather than her own pet. By the end of the day, Ben had taken more than 100 photos, interviewed at least a dozen townspeople, and left with promises to send the article once it was published. The festival wound down as the sun dipped low, casting long shadows across the street. The air cooled, and the lanterns strung between stalls began to glow softly, giving everything a golden warmth. The sound of fiddles and laughter carried into the crisp evening. Max lay at Margaret's feet, his head resting on her boot, breathing slow and deep, the satisfied exhaustion of a day well spent. No one in Bailey Springs knew it yet, but that harvest festival had planted a seed. A few weeks later, when Ben's article went to print, it would be picked up by other outlets, spreading the story of the dog mayor far beyond county lines. And soon, Max wouldn't just be their mayor. He would be America's most famous small-town politician. For now, though, the only thing that mattered was the flicker of lanterns, the smell of pumpkin pie, and the way people lingered just a little longer, unwilling to let go of the day. And in the middle of it all, Mayor Max, content and beloved, slept through the last song of the night. It began quietly. One cool November morning, about 3 weeks after the Harvest Festival, Margaret found a large manila envelope in her mailbox. Inside was a neatly folded magazine, the glossy pages smelling faintly of fresh ink. On the cover, tucked into the lower right corner, was a small teaser line. "Meet America's most unusual mayor." Page 14. Margaret carried it inside like it was something delicate. She set it on the kitchen table, poured herself a cup of coffee, and carefully turned the pages until she reached the headline, "The American Town That Elected a Dog as Mayor." The photo took up half the spread. Max, sitting in front of the gazebo, scarf perfectly in place, with the maple leaves behind him glowing like fire. The autumn light made his fur look almost unreal, the kind of golden that painters mix for hours trying to get just right. The article, written by Ben Carter, was warm and playful. He described Bailey Springs as a place where time is politely encouraged to move a little slower, and Max as the most approachable mayor in the United States. No appointment necessary, just bring a tennis ball. He included quotes from townspeople. "He listens better than most politicians I know. Mr. Donnelly, owner of the hardware store. You can't bribe him unless you've got peanut butter. Mrs. Wilkins from the library." Ben even mentioned the portograph station at the festival. calling it the highlight of the year for both the mayor and his constituents. Margaret smiled through the whole thing. She clipped the pages and set them on the counter, thinking it was a nice keepsake. Something the town would chuckle over for a few weeks before life went back to normal. But the article didn't stay neatly contained within the pages of a regional magazine. The first sign came 2 days later, when the phone rang at the general store. Mr. Donnelly answered, expecting an order for nails or paint, and instead found himself speaking to a producer from a morning radio show in Chicago. They'd seen the piece online and wanted to interview the folks behind the famous dog mayor. The next day, Margaret's phone, the line, because cell reception in Bailey Springs was notoriously patchy, rang 3 times before lunch. A journalist from Seattle, a podcast host from Vermont, even someone from a national newspaper asking for high-resolution photos. It turned out that Ben's article had been picked up by the Associated Press, and once it appeared on their wire, it traveled everywhere. Newspapers, websites, blogs. Within a week, the headline was popping up on news feeds across the country. America's dog mayor wins hearts. Golden retriever governs small town. In this American town, the mayor has 4 legs and a tail. The town's Facebook page, which previously saw maybe a handful of posts each month, was suddenly flooded with messages. People wanted to know if they could visit. Could they send letters to the mayor? Would Max be available for photos? Did he do meet? It was flattering, of course, but also overwhelming. Bailey Springs wasn't used to strangers showing up. The occasional tourist, yes, but not people arriving with cameras and gifts for the mayor. The first visitors came from just a few towns over. Then a couple from Nebraska made the trip, saying they'd read the article while sipping coffee and decided to make a weekend of it. The cafe owner, Lucy, started selling a new drink called the Mayor's Mocha, just to see if anyone would order it. They did. Through it all, Max remained. Max. He didn't understand he was famous. He still greeted the mail carrier with the same enthusiasm, still insisted on his afternoon nap in the sun. But he was beginning to notice something different on his walks. People he'd never met calling out his name, kneeling down to pat his head, treating him like an old friend they'd been waiting years to meet. One Saturday afternoon, as Margaret was heading to the post office, she noticed a car pull up slowly beside them. A woman in the passenger seat leaned out, her phone in hand, and asked, "Excuse me, is that the Mayor Max?" Margaret chuckled. "Well, he's the only mayor we've got." The woman laughed, thanked her, and snapped a photo before they drove off. It was the first time Margaret truly realized this wasn't just a passing story. It had taken root in the wider world. People wanted a piece of it, and Bailey Springs, in its own quiet way, was about to find itself on the map. That night, she sat on the porch with Max curled at her feet, listening to the soft hum of crickets. Somewhere out there, in dozens of homes she'd never see, people were reading about her dog and smiling. It was a strange thought, but a warm one. And she couldn't help but wonder, if the world already loved him this much, what would happen when they actually met him in person? The first wave came quietly. A silver minivan without out-of-state plates rolled into Bailey Springs one misty Thursday morning. It parked by the general store, and out stepped a family. Mum, Dad, 2 kids, all dressed in fleece jackets and holding paper coffee cups. They looked around like they'd stepped into a postcard, the kind where nothing moves except the breeze in the trees. Margaret was just locking her front gate when they spotted her. "Excuse me," the mother asked, almost sheepish. "Is the mayor around?" It was the first time Margaret had been asked the question so directly by complete strangers. She pointed toward the porch, where Max was stretching in the sun. The kids gasped, as if they'd spotted a celebrity, and hurried over. Max trotted down the steps, tail swishing lazily, and in the space of 30 seconds had turned them into lifelong constituents. One head tilt, one warm lick on the hand, and they were gone, charmed beyond reason. The encounter lasted maybe 5 minutes, but it was a preview of what was coming. Within a week, there were more cars with unfamiliar plates parked along Main Street. Couples with cameras hung around the cafe. Retirees wandered slowly past the post office, clearly stalling until they caught sight of the mayor. Some carried the magazine article folded in their pockets, pulling it out to compare the photos with the real thing. By the 3rd week, the rhythm of the town began to change. The general store ordered extra soda and chips. Lucy at the cafe added an entire mayor's menu, including the perfect latte with a swirl of caramel and the 4-legged muffin, blueberry. Of course, the library display that once featured local history books now held a small stack of paw print stationery for people to write letters to Max. At first, most visitors were polite, keeping their distance until Margaret gave a nod. But word spreads quickly, and soon people started arriving who weren't shy at all. There were the YouTubers who set up tripods on the green, narrating loudly about the famous American dog mayor. There were day trippers who tried to coax Max into their selfies with squeaky toys. There was even a young couple from Texas who arrived in matching Vote Max t-shirts, as though they'd stepped straight out of a campaign rally. Margaret did her best to keep things smooth. She learned to set boundaries without sounding unfriendly. No flash photography in Max's face. No feeding him treats without asking. Most visitors respected the rules. Some even brought donations for the animal shelter as a thank you. But there were moments when the sudden attention felt strange. Like the Saturday morning when Margaret stepped outside to water her flowers and found a tour bus idling at the end of the street. The guide was speaking into a microphone, describing Bailey Springs as home to America's most beloved politician. Through the tinted windows, Margaret could see heads turning, cameras lifting. It felt surreal, as if the quiet little town she'd known all her life had become a stop on some oddball history tour. Bailey Springs adapted the way small towns often do, with a mix of curiosity, mild inconvenience, and entrepreneurial creativity. The hardware store started selling Mayor Max bumper stickers. The bakery put paw prints on their sugar cookies. Someone even began carving little wooden figurines of Max wearing his mayoral scarf. And Max didn't notice the economics or the novelty factor. He only noticed that more hands were available to scratch behind his ears. More people were around to toss a ball. More smiles followed him down the street. The tourists, in his mind, were simply an expanded circle of friends. One evening, as the sun dipped low and painted the rooftops orange, Margaret sat on the porch, watching a pair of visitors take photos of the gazebo. She realized that the town's pace had shifted permanently. It wasn't unwelcome, but it was different. The old, quiet, now shared space with a gentle hum of footsteps, laughter, and car doors closing. She sipped her tea and glanced down at Max. "You've gone and done it, haven't you?" she said softly. Max looked up at her, eyes warm, as if to say, "I just showed up. The rest is on them." And maybe he was right. The town was still Bailey Springs, just with a little more sparkle, and a mayor whose approval ratings seemed to grow with every wag of his tail. Margaret was in the kitchen, standing over a pot of chicken soup, when the landline rang. She almost didn't answer. Half the time it was a robocall, and she didn't have the patience for another urgent offer about extending her car warranty. But the voice on the other end wasn't selling anything. "Hi, this is Stephanie from Good Morning America. We'd like to do a feature on Mayor Max." Margaret blinked. "The morning show." "Yes, ma'am. America's most beloved dog mayor. We've had viewers write in. Our producers are very excited. Would you be willing to coordinate a visit?" 2 weeks later, the quiet of Bailey Springs was interrupted by the low rumble of a news van pulling into Main Street. It was larger than any vehicle the town usually saw, except maybe the feed trucks that came during harvest. The sides of the van were plastered with bold red and blue letters, and a satellite dish was mounted on top like a strange metallic flower. Out spilled a team of 4, 2 camera operators, a sound technician with a fuzzy boom mic, and a reporter in a bright teal blazer that looked far too polished for the gravel roads of Bailey Springs. The townspeople noticed. Oh, they noticed. From the post office steps, Mr. Daniels squinted like he was trying to recognize the reporter from somewhere. The cafe windows fogged slightly as faces pressed against the glass for a better view. Even the barber paused mid-trim to peek outside. Margaret had agreed to meet them on the green. She'd dressed in her neatest cardigan and brushed Max until his coat shone like fresh honey in the morning sun. Around his neck she tied the mayoral scarf, deep red, with mayor embroidered in gold thread. It looked almost ceremonial. "Mayor Max," the reporter exclaimed, crouching slightly as if greeting an actual human dignitary. "It's an honor to meet you." Max, sensing the new energy, wagged once and sat politely. The cameraman circled, catching shots from every angle, while the sound tech angled the microphone toward the gentle huff of Max's breathing. The interview was strange, in the way only small-town interviews can be. The reporter asked Margaret about Max's policies. Margaret replied that he was strongly in favor of belly rubs and afternoon naps. They asked about the secret to his popularity. She said it probably had something to do with the way he greeted everyone without judgment, never raised taxes, and always looked happy to see you. When they filmed cutaway shots, The crew asked a few townsfolk for comments. "He's the best mayor we've ever had," said Lucy from the cafe, straight-faced. "Doesn't talk too much, gets things done. Better manners than most politicians," added Mr. Daniels, nodding gravely. For the final segment, they decided to shoot a walk-through-town scene. Margaret and Max strolled down Main Street, while the reporter narrated into the camera about the heartwarming story that's captured the nation's imagination. Behind them, curious neighbors pretended to browse shop windows just to make it into the background. That night, the broadcast went out across America. The segment was barely 3 minutes long, but it lit a fuse. Emails started arriving from as far as Oregon and Maine. The Bailey Springs post office handled more letters in a week than they usually did in a month. Envelopes addressed simply to Mayor Max, Bailey Springs, USA. Some came with small gifts, hand-knitted scarves, dog biscuits shaped like bones, even a tiny key to the city sent by a dog-loving mayor in another state. And somewhere in the middle of it all, Bailey Springs realized that this wasn't just a local curiosity anymore. Their golden retriever mare had become a national story. The kind that could show up on someone's living room TV and make them smile before their morning coffee. As for Max, he didn't seem to notice the fame. He accepted the attention the way he accepted everything, gently, without fuss, and with the unshakable confidence of someone who's never had to check a poll number. Margaret, though, began to wonder how long the peace would hold. Fame, even the gentle kind, had a way of rearranging things. And in Bailey Springs, rearranging things wasn't something that happened often. At first, it was just a few curious travelers. They'd arrive in dusty sedans or rented SUV, pulling into Bailey Springs with a folded map on the dashboard and that cautious, half-apologetic look tourists sometimes wear. They'd step into the cafe, order coffee, and then, almost shyly, ask, "Where can we find the mayor?" Lucy would smile behind the counter, tilt her head toward the green, and say, "If you don't see him, just wait a bit. He usually shows up." And sure enough, Max would be there before long, trotting along with Margaret, or stretched out in the shade like he had nowhere better to be. The visitors would light up. Out came the phones, the cameras, the soft click of shutters. Some brought squeaky toys as gifts. Others asked Margaret to pose with Max for just one more picture. Margaret didn't mind, not at first. She'd always been proud of Max, but as the weeks passed, the trickle of visitors became a steady stream. Cars began parking along Main Street, where there'd usually been space enough for a whole Saturday market. Shopkeepers noticed new faces wandering in, buying souvenirs that had never existed before. Mugs with paw prints, T-shirts reading Bailey Springs, home of Mayor Max. Someone even started selling postcards with Max's photos, taken from the TV broadcast. The town liked the business, or most of the town did. Some people felt the pace shifting. The quiet mornings on the green were now peppered with strangers calling out Max. Over here, the post office got so many packages for the mayor that the clerk had to clear a whole shelf just to store them. Even the diner began fielding calls from people asking about reservation times, a thing that had never, in the town's history, been necessary. One Saturday, Margaret and Max returned from their usual walk to find a small tour bus idling near the old courthouse. A guide with a microphone was telling a group of 40 about the famous dog mayor and his delightful rural community. Max, ever agreeable, wagged his tail at the crowd. They surged forward, hands outstretched, the bus driver trying to keep them from blocking the road. Margaret smiled politely, but her eyes darted to the side, looking for a clear path home. Bailey Springs had always been the kind of place where everyone knew your name, and nothing much happened without warning. But now, things were happening whether the town was ready or not. It wasn't bad, exactly, just different. The local paper started running a Mayor Max sightings column, partly as a joke, and partly because readers demanded it. Families drove in from 2 states over to get a picture on the bench where Max liked to nap. And every so often, Margaret would catch a neighbor muttering about the old days, when the biggest excitement was the 4th of July picnic. Max didn't seem to notice the shift. He still greeted everyone with the same calm dignity, still lay in the sun without a care. But Margaret knew change was in the air, and change, she thought, could be like a breeze, gentle enough to cool you, or strong enough to carry things away. For now, Bailey Springs was still itself, but for the first time, Margaret wondered how long it would stay that way. It began as a half-serious suggestion during a Wednesday town council meeting. The council usually met in the back room of the library, where the chairs creaked and the old radiator made faint knocking sounds. The agenda was small, the kind of items that could be summed up in 15 minutes. Repainting the bench by the post office, replacing the bulb in the streetlight near the feed store, whether or not to approve a permit for Mrs. Harper's new chicken coop. Then Frank, the owner of the general store, cleared his throat. "You know," he said, tapping his pencil against the table, "people are coming here for Max. Maybe we ought to give them something to come for." "What do you mean?" asked Councilwoman Denise. "I mean, a festival, a day, something special. Call it Mayor Max Day. We could sell food, run music, maybe a parade. Folks will spend money in town. Could be good for everyone." There was a pause. It wasn't that the idea was bad. In fact, it was exactly the kind of small-town logic that made sense. But it felt like a turning point. Bailey Springs had never built an event around one of its own before, especially not one with 4 legs and a wagging tail. Margaret was there, sitting quietly at the end of the table with Max at her feet. She looked down at him. He looked up at her. Neither of them seemed opposed, and so the vote passed. The first Mayor Max Day was set for the 2nd Saturday in June. In the weeks leading up to it, Main Street transformed. Paper banners were strung between lampposts. Local kids painted paw prints on plywood signs with bright blues and yellows. The bakery announced Max's favorite cookies, peanut butter treats shaped like bones. Even the hardware store got involved, selling official Mayor Max scarves in red and gold. People from neighboring towns began asking about the schedule. Will there be a parade? Yes. Will Max ride in it? Of course. The morning of the festival dawned warm and sunny. Margaret brushed Max until his fur gleamed, tied his scarf neatly, and set out for the green. The air already carried the smells of frying dough, grilled corn, and sweet lemonade. The parade was simple. A tractor pulling a flatbed decked with bales of hay, a handful of local kids dressed as town council members, and, at the center, Max sitting tall on a cushioned chair. His tail wagged gently, and every time they passed a group of onlookers, someone shouted, "We love you, Mayor Max." The day rolled on with music from the school band, sack races on the grass, and a Meet the Mayor booth where visitors could shake Max's paw and take a photo. Margaret kept a bowl of fresh water nearby and made sure Max got breaks in the shade. By late afternoon, the sun dipped low, casting long golden light across the festival. The raffle was announced, the last lemonade was poured, and the sound of laughter and chatter filled the air. It was perfect, almost too perfect. The town had made money, sure. Shops sold out of half their stock. The cafe had a line out the door all day. But some residents, the ones who remembered Bailey Springs before the TV cameras, felt a strange ache they couldn't name. It was the first time their little town had felt like it was performing. Margaret noticed it too. She smiled for the visitors, kept Max calm in the crowd. But inside she wondered if this was the beginning of something bigger than they could control. Still, as the evening ended and the last of the visitors drifted away, Max curled up at Margaret's feet, completely content. The green was quiet again, the lights from the booths winking out one by one. For a brief moment, Bailey Springs felt like itself again. But the echo of the cheers and the clink of the cash register lingered in the air, hinting that Mayor Max Day would not be a one-time affair. The seasons in Idlewild had a way of moving gently, as though the mountains themselves were in no rush to turn the pages of the year. After the long golden afternoons of summer faded, autumn rolled in not with fanfare, but with the quiet crunch of leaves under paws and the faint scent of pine sap in the cool air. Mayor Max, now well into his later years, moved more slowly than before. The once bounding golden retriever, who used to greet visitors with a joyful leap, now preferred a steady, measured trot. His fur had grown lighter round the muzzle, like the first dusting of snow on a sunny morning, but his eyes, deep, warm pools of amber still, carried that same spark of recognition whenever he saw an old friend. The townsfolk noticed the change, of course. They adjusted their greetings, no longer calling from across the street for Max to come running, but instead meeting him halfway, bending down so he wouldn't have to crane his neck. Children, once eager to tug him toward the park, now walked beside him at his pace, as if they instinctively understood that some things were better savored than hurried. The mayor's office was still the same. Max's spot on the porch of the little wooden building with the flag fluttering lazily above, but his working hours were shorter. On colder mornings, he stayed curled on a blanket by the window, the sun warming his back, while townsfolk came to him with gentle pats and soft words. His chief of staff, as always, handled the human side of mayoral duties. but Max still presided over the spirit of the place. As the days grew shorter, an unspoken agreement seemed to settle over Idlewild. They would make the most of whatever time their mayor had left. Special days were arranged without being called special days. One morning, the bakery sent over a basket of fresh bread, just so Max could have the heel with a little butter. Another afternoon, the school children painted signs not for any campaign, but to line the street with bright colors and paw prints for him to see on his walk. Even the tourists, many of whom had read about Max's story in magazines or online, seemed to sense they were stepping into something delicate. They spoke in softer tones, took their photos from a respectful distance, and left small offerings, bones, tennis balls, even handwritten notes that his human family kept in a wooden box. And yet Max himself seemed utterly at peace. He had no sense of the ticking clock, no fear of what lay ahead. For him there was only the warmth of a hand on his head, the familiar scent of pine, the hum of voices that meant community. In his own quiet way, he had taught the town the same lesson he had lived by, that leadership was not about power, but about presence. As winter approached, snow began to dust the rooftops, and Max's walks became shorter still. But every step was accompanied by a neighbor, by a child, by someone who had once been a stranger but was now a friend. His last days were not marked by sadness alone, but by an overwhelming sense of gratitude, shared by everyone who had ever knelt to scratch his ears or whisper, "Good boy, Mayor Max." It was as though the whole town had slowed its heartbeat to match his own. When the day finally came, the mountains seemed quieter than usual, as if the pines themselves were holding their breath. Mayor Max's passing was not met with ceremony or fanfare. Instead, it was met with the soft murmur of neighbors checking on one another, the low hum of the bakery oven working overtime, and the muffled crunch of footsteps in the snow as people made their way to the heart of town. No one had to say, "Let's gather." They simply did. From shopkeepers to school children, from long-time residents to weekend tourists who had stumbled into something bigger than themselves. Everyone found themselves drawn to the same place. In the center of the square, the big wooden chair where Max had so often sat was draped with his red mayor scarf, now dusted with snowflakes. A small pile of his favorite toys sat neatly beside it, a faded tennis ball, a well-chewed bone, and a frayed rope tug that looked as though it had been loved almost to pieces. There were tears, of course, but there were also quiet smiles, because no one in Idlewild could think of Max without remembering the way his tail had wagged like it was powered by pure joy, or the way he made strangers feel like they'd been part of the town forever. In the weeks that followed, something remarkable happened. The rhythm of the town didn't speed up to fill the void he left. Instead, it kept moving at the same gentle pace he had set. People still stopped to chat in the middle of the street. Kids still left drawings in the bakery window. Tourists still came, not just to see the mountains, but to hear the story of the town with the dog mayor. The wooden chair remained in the square. The scarf was replaced each season, sometimes with a fresh red one, sometimes with something hand-knit by a local. And every year, on the date of his passing, The townsfolk gathered again. They didn't call it a memorial. They called it Mayor Mac's Day, and it was exactly what he would have wanted. Long walks, shared meals, children laughing, and an unhurried sense of simply being together. Even new residents, people who had never met Max, came to understand the weight of his legacy. You could see it in the way they slowed their cars when a neighbor crossed the street, or how they lingered just a little longer when saying goodbye on a front porch. Max had never signed a law, passed a budget, or given a speech. But he had led with something far rarer, a heart that saw no strangers, only friends. And so, long after his paw prints had faded from the dusty streets, the shape of his presence remained woven into the fabric of Idlewild, like the scent of pine after rain. If you stand in the square on a quiet afternoon, you can still hear his tags jingling as he trots by, the soft thump of his tail against the mayor's chair. And if you close your eyes, you might even feel it, the gentle weight of a golden retriever's head resting against your knee, reminding you, in the simplest way possible, that you belong. And so the town kept its claim to fame, not as the place where a dog was once mayor, but as the place where a community learned how to follow the lead of kindness, and never forgot